Okay, so first of all, I'll tell everybody how happy I am to be back out here. It's been quite some time, and of course the reason for the long hiatus is probably well known to you, and it's generally comes under the rubric of the exigencies of fighting a war, which requires sometimes that you don't operate according to a fixed schedule, but that you do what has to get done when it has to get done. And but fortunately, right now, one of the things that has to get done is that we have to master the ideas of principle that come broadly under the concept of a Riemannian concept of dynamics. And so that creates an opportunity for the requirements of success in our war that I get a chance to share with you some ideas which hopefully will help you in getting an understanding of Riemannian dynamics for yourself. Now, I probably also should give the relevant disclaimer that what I will discuss is certain ideas and certain things that I've been working on at the inspiration of Lin on over many years to try and develop pedagogically and be able to get an understanding of this idea of Riemannian dynamics, especially from the standpoint of something that Lin has been talking about for as long as I've known him, which is now going on 35 years. But on the relationship between on this question of Riemannian dynamics from the standpoint of science and art, and particularly of the example of the relationship between Riemannian ideas of science and Beethoven, the method of musical composition exemplified by Beethoven's musical compositions, especially his late quartets, although this is more broadly understood as the concept of the well-tempered system of bel canto polyphony, which you have to trace from Bach through Mozart and Beethoven, and then you can include also the works of Schubert and Brahms in that as well. As I say, Lin has been discussing this question of the relationship between science and art since I've seen things he's written back in the early 60s where he's already discussing this question. This is very central to his discovery, and of course he's elaborated many places over the years. But one sort of turning point that I can refer to, which I mentioned in my unfinished work, Pedagogy, which I think at least the unfinished portion is available to, the finished portion is available to you. The unfinished portion was not made available to you because it's still unfinished. But Lin, I quote it from a paper that he wrote in 1986, where I think he put out this challenge in a very clear and provocative way, where it was in a paper actually on June 10th, 1986, so we're coming up on the 22nd anniversary of the release of this document, in which he demanded a one-year program to elaborate the implications of Couza's breakthrough on his ontological breakthrough for the problem of modern science. And he raises in that paper a lot of the questions which he's been discussing more recently in terms of the question of the role. He's referred back to that period, which was when he was having those arguments and discussions with many of the top scientists in the country on the significance of Kepler for solving some of the problems of modern physics, especially nuclear fusion, and that outside of Dr. Moon, Robert Moon, most of the scientists were unable to free themselves from their attachment to mathematical formalism and reductionism, that they couldn't quite grasp what Lin was saying, although some made some important and significant efforts to do that. And in this paper he said something that was, I think, went over everybody's head there. But he said that the key to, he says, about time that we break down finally and once and for all this division between science and art, and that the scientist has to realize that Beethoven's method of musical composition is nothing less than a elaboration of the same kinds of concepts that Riemann develops with this idea of Riemann surface function, specifically from the standpoint of what he referred to then as an anti-entropic principle of least action. And so, of course, he asked that this be completed, this project be completed within the course of 1 year, which means it should have been completed by June 10th, 1987. Now, we failed to meet that timetable. And of course, a lot happened to intervene to prevent us from meeting that timetable, some of which was external to us in terms of a massive deployment on the part of the British Empire and their allies to try and prevent us from meeting that timetable, including the famous October 1986 armed raid on our headquarters there in Leesburg, the subsequent legal trials which occurred, the indictments of up to 40 or 50 people, the jailing of Lin and many others, the numerous trials and so forth that former Attorney General Ramsey Clark summarized as the biggest assault on any political movement that he's ever seen in his lifetime or that he ever knew of. So that did intervene in the way. However, there's also another aspect to that, which Lin has pointed to, that intervened also, that impeded the progress in reaching this, getting this thing accomplished, and that was the anti-science proclivities of the baby boomer generation, including the baby boomers in his own organization. And he has discussed the fact that in the 1980s, many of the scientists that we were working with, who Lin was discussing this with, and of course they did not accept what Lin was saying. And I'm not pointing to them as people who accepted it, but they were of Lin's generation. They were the World War II generation, and they had a serious problem that is probably typified by the argument that Einstein had with almost everybody except a few of his generation of scientists. Einstein was, I guess, the generation before World War II, you could say. But Einstein had a argument with everybody of his generation and of and the succeeding generations all throughout his life on this question of, which we will talk more about in detail, but just to sort of give it a name, was against mathematical formalism and Aristotelianism in science. And Einstein basically lost the fight. He did not succeed in winning over the scientific community to his worldview. They abandoned him, even though Einstein had made the crucial breakthrough on which all 20th century physics was based. Nevertheless, there was a even worse degeneration among the baby boomers generation, who, among other things, were totally and completely brainwashed by mathematical formalism. This, of course, coincided with the rise of the digital computer, the losing out by Vannevar Bush's defeat in terms of getting the computing machines to be focused on the analog methods, and instead to become totally digital, and along with that, the philosophical rise of the information technologies and information theory that of von Neumann and Wiener and so forth that that Lin fought back in the late 1940s. And so the baby boomer generation that was sort of steeped in a kind of bizarre sexual fantasy towards the power of digital computers to end science, all scientific inquiry, and replace it with multiple calculations, that somehow that the need for ideas in science had come to an end, and science now could proceed on the basis of faster and faster microprocessors. And of course, you see the effects of that in all kinds of manifestations, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it because the matter has been treated quite adequately, including by some people here, in the work on the Devil in Your Laptop pamphlet and the work that's done on that you guys have already done on the digital and analog computer. But you see sort of this insanity is typified by the Al Gore's global warming hoax, right? Which is nothing but the product of information technology. It's nothing but the product of Norbert Wiener and John von Neumann's informatics, where a highly nonlinear process, which we will talk about, the climate, which is actually not the climate. There's no such thing as climate. Climate is a manifestation of a relationship of what Vernadsky called the interaction of the abiotic, biotic, and noetic noosphere interacting, and that has an effect of that is expressed by various physical parameters in the biosphere of the Earth. And to try and subject that nonlinear process, which we will discuss more thoroughly, to forms of digital linearization produces the fraud of global warming, which is nothing but a complete fraud. But the fact that a computer can produce a fraud is not really that scandalous. What's scandalous is that people believe the fraud because it was produced by a computer. And therefore they say that, you have people running around, and we see the effect. People are dying today, right now, as we meet here today. People are rioting in parts of the world for bread. Basic food, bread, rice, grains, food grains. Because people believe this fraud, this fascist fraud that was emitted from a digital computer as being truthful, and they're destroying food production for the benefit of biofuels and other insanities, and speculating up the price of food, and it's having the effect in the real world, not a computer generated effect, of people dying of starvation. They're not dying on a computer screen. They're real human beings, and they're real children who are hungry because people believe bullshit that came out of a computer because they believe they don't understand real science, they don't understand dynamics. So that typifies the degeneration in the baby boomer generation, which this lack of a real understanding of science, which also impeded our ability to actually accomplish what Lin had set out, demanded we accomplish in that paper. However, as you know, and because of the work you've done, that we're actually probably in a better situation now than we were 22 years ago to actually really do this, because we are actually implementing that policy largely through the work that Lin broadly calls the basement process. Right? And the basement process is, of course, obviously the people who are working in the basement, but the basement process is totally evident now by both how it functions and how it's increasingly coming to function, is involving the entire youth movement to actually rework and develop on a much higher level than has ever been done before, probably in history, not just in the history of this organization, but in all history. These fundamental ideas leading up to a general understanding of what I would call an understanding of Riemannian dynamics from the standpoint of LaRouche. Now, which is the forefront of science. There is nothing beyond this. I mean, there is things beyond it. There are discoveries left to be made. But if you want to know where modern science stands, what's the frontier of modern science, it's the questions that are unanswered or that are posed by the understanding of Riemannian dynamics from the standpoint of Lin's development in physical economy. So Lin has, as he calls it, a narrow path for us to proceed to get up to that level of the frontier of science. People are not quite on the level of the frontier of science yet, but people have a sense of where it is. You know where the frontier is. And you can get to that frontier through this narrow path, which is mastering Kepler, which the basement side of things has completed the 2 steps of that. And you have to have both steps, not just the new astronomy, but also the harmonies. You have to actually look at all of Kepler's work. We have the very important and very helpful contribution which was added by Jason on these translations and introductions he wrote to the Fermat's work, which is a very, very crucial step, which I think everybody can have a lot of fun with in terms of developing presentations and pedagogical demonstrations on Fermat's work on the principle of least action. And now you have coming out, I think you've had a chance to at least look at some of the stuff they put out up on the Gauss project. And they're not completed. They have, if you go to the Gauss page, there's a lot of pages, buttons you click on, and it says coming soon. So they're not completed, but what's up there is quite impressive. And then we move on, which is the period they're in right now, transitioning into the work on Riemann. But that's the way you get there. You can't shortcut it. You can't short circuit it. And this is done as you're working through this with the simultaneous, increasingly intense and very serious work on the development of an understanding of the well-tempered system of bel canto polyphony. Because the 2 things are required. As you know, Lin is, as I said in the beginning, as Lin has always emphasized, but also in terms of developing the conceptual capacity for understanding this idea of Riemannian dynamics, you have to be working simultaneously on rigorous science and rigorous musical development, choral musical development. Now, other forms of artistic endeavors are very important and helpful and useful. I'm not demeaning them, but the efficiency of choral work is unsurpassed, because it's a rigorous participation. It's a means by which everybody, there's nobody who can't participate in experiencing a rigorous effort to not just to listen to music, but to actually participate in the creation of a great work of art. Because to understand art, you can't just be a fan of art. You can't just like art. You can't just appreciate. It's not art appreciation. It's to actually get inside the creative process as it's expressed in a great work of art. And obviously, the number of great creative composers is very small. So you're not going to expect everybody to get inside of it from the standpoint of composition, but from the standpoint of participating in the replication and experiencing of what the creative process is expressed in art is, there's nothing that surpasses the development of the singing voice in the development of a chorus, because it's something that everybody can actually get involved in and actually experience a very meaningful, getting meaningfully inside creativity and art. So we never had this before in this organization, I know for sure, and I doubt seriously. I mean, I'm 99%, 100% convinced. I know no one's going to point to an example of ever a time in history where you had so many people seriously working on science and art the way we have. Lynn has developed the youth, has got the process going in the youth movement internationally. And so we're actually in a better position now than ever before to accomplish this achievement that Lynn proposed be accomplished within 1 year, almost 22 years ago. So what I will do, as I said, is to just give you some ideas that I've been working on, which hopefully will point you in some direction as you proceed on this. But it's meant to sort of give you to sort of aid in your discussion, not to be to aid the discussion, but the pathway to grasping it. There's no way to shortcut it. In other words, to the actual rigorous hard work of really mastering, getting inside Kepler's idea, getting inside Gauss's discoveries, solving the problem that Lynn has posed from the standpoint of Gauss, as well as Kepler, right? Because you have the distinction that Kepler not only tells you what he discovered, but you get it inside his mind of how he discovered it. Whereas Gauss gives you the result, but not the inside of his mind. So the study, the mastery of both Kepler and Gauss gets you a familiarity with how to actually deal with getting inside the creative process. The Kepler gives you the first level, but Gauss is a bigger challenge. But Gauss is nevertheless important. You have to get inside his mind, but there's a different challenge there. And then, so you have that ahead of you, and by the time you get through with all that, the Riemann work will be waiting for you. You'll probably be getting some interim reports from the Riemann group, whatever they get started and whatever they do, which we will all be very happy and eagerly awaiting. That they'll be as surprising and happily nonlinear as the work that has so far been produced by the Kepler, Gauss, and the Fermat work. So that's my plan, and so we'll have two discussions. I understand we'll go for a couple hours this afternoon and then take a break and do some more work this evening on this question of this relationship between science and art. As I titled it on my sort of to focus the discussion, the importance of understanding the importance of Riemann's late quartets for understanding Riemann's P function. And I'll say it now, I'll probably say it 50 times in the course of this discussion, that the purpose here is not to try and understand art from the standpoint of science, but the purpose here is to try and use the insights from art and look at the relationship between art and science to understand, get inside the creative process itself, at least to get a greater self-conscious understanding of the creative process. So as you're and I'll do this by way of sort of giving you a general conceptual outline and probably using a few examples to illustrate the point, but not to provide I've written some of this stuff up. I'll be writing more up, and you can go. You'll have plenty of chance to go through the detailed development of some of these ideas, which will be required to fully understand what I'm talking about here. But as you know, as Lynn keeps stressing, right, you have to, if you want to be able to understand both what's happening in the world today and also understand what solutions are required, is what the state of the world is, what the state of the world must be. You have to it's not a matter of understanding details. There's a lot of truthful details out there which are highly relevant to which you must know, and which are relevant to being able to understand what's going on in the world. That's obviously one step above most people who don't know any details of relevance. They know lots of details, but none of them are relevant to anything. But you do have the key to being able to accomplish our job, which is to steer the world from this precipice. That Lynn says it's we're closer to global war than we've ever been in mankind's history. That is extremely dangerous situation. We're on the collapse, not on the precipice, not of a or in the middle of, not of a minor or even a major financial and economic crisis. We're on the cusp of and in the beginning stages of a complete unraveling of civilization itself. I think Lynn once put it, that mankind has sinned against civilization in the past, but we've never repudiated civilization. And we're facing actually that kind of crisis. Not that people, the world, history has seen bad cultures, and history has seen horrible things done in times when bad things done to civilization, which have caused massive destruction of human life and impeded human progress. But even in those times, the idea that there must be that man must be civilized was not taken into account. And Lynn has characterized our situation today as one in which in which mankind is actually, we're seeing it in front of our eyes. You can see it. You see the arguments. You see the arguments from Al Gore. The argument that is being made is that we should repudiate civilization altogether. That we should actually tolerate a world in which the majority of mankind becomes uncivilized. And whole parts of the earth are written off as terra incognita, to be ruled over by a small oligarchy to benefit from the raw materials and resources and labor of the uncivilized hordes which they permit to exist. So that's our job. We got to prevent that, and we have to do something more, because we have to replace it with something that actually is an advance of civilization like mankind has never seen before. And that advance of civilization is best characterized by the idea of the American system. We have to complete the American system. We have to do what FDR did, what FDR dreamed of, which is to make the ideas of the American system the basis of relations among nations, and also the basis for the internal relationship of human beings everywhere on this planet. That's not the particular any particular details of the American system, but the principle. As Lincoln said, a nation dedicated to an idea, to a proposition, and that proposition, that an organization of society based on ideas, and this idea of man as the fundamental difference between man and animals being the creative powers of mankind, that organization of society and relations among nations must be the basis for the organization of civilization. So we have to prevent the repudiation of civilization, and to accomplish a advance of civilization which mankind has been struggling with, at least in our known recorded history, for at least 3,000 years. We have to complete that job. And we're fortunate enough to live in a time when that can happen, because it beheld to live in a time when you didn't have that opportunity, which means you should be happy that you live in a time in which the whole thing's going to hell, because otherwise there wouldn't be a chance to turn it around into purgatory. So, but to accomplish that job, we've got to actually think as be able to be comfortable to think, to be instinctively think, to have it in your nature of thinking. What Lynn is talking about from with respect to Riemannian dynamics. It's you can't know how things are unfolding in the world today. You'll get distracted. You'll get off. You'll get into digressions. If you try and figure out the world today as a accumulation of facts, compilation of facts, and try and keep track of developments as facts, you have to have a sense of the dynamic process of what's going on. And you can't figure out what kind of policies are necessary. Like Lynn's idea of a 4-power agreement, or the construction of the Bering Strait Tunnel. What kinds of proposals you have to stick to get a shift, to steer mankind into this direction. Unless you're thinking of history, of the development of mankind, and of the scientific requirements of the development of the Earth and the solar system and beyond, from the standpoint of Riemannian dynamics. Now, and so that requires mastering a concept of what Einstein later called a finite but unbounded notion of the universe, or Lynn has sometimes referred to as a finite but self-bounded idea of the universe, which I think is, to be more precise, should said finite, self-bounded, and unlimited. So you get all three ideas in there, and you actually get the sense. So that's sort of the subject. What do we mean by a universe? What's the concept of a universe that is finite, unbounded, and self-bounded, and unlimited? Because those seem to be three contradictory terms. But of course, as Linda's pointed out, if you want to discuss an idea that nobody has had before, you have to you have to discuss it in words that people know the meaning of. You can't just make up a new word and say, here's my idea, and give it a new word and go around and just say that word and think everybody's going to know the meaning of that word. And you'll say, you know what I mean. And you just make up a word because you like the sound of it, right? You have to use words that people know, but you have to use those words to induce and inspire the people to form a concept in their own minds that they never had before. And the concept of a finite, self-bounded, and unlimited universe is not something people have a real concept of. Now, the reason why is because if you try and derive a concept of the universe, as Linda's pointed out, from the standpoint of sense perception, that is, from the standpoint of when we talk about sense perception, we talk primarily of most people think of the science of vision. If you try and get a concept of the universe from the science of vision, you will not get a concept of a finite, unlimited, and self-bounded universe. You have to have work on a different basis. And but I think if you look at, you can begin to get a more informed idea of what of this idea of a finite, self-bounded, and unlimited universe by approaching it both from the standpoint. In fact, I think the only way you can do it is to approach it both from the standpoint of science and art. You have in the particular example that we will use, science and music, where you're actually using both the domain of vision and the domain of hearing to form what Riemann would call an exact concept. And I introduced my paper with the idea of an exact of Riemann's fragment, of a scientific fragment, where he says that science is the attempt to understand nature by an exact concept, and that modern science would have a problem with Riemann's statement there. Not that they wouldn't think they agreed with it, but what they think they agree with is not what Riemann intended, because they wouldn't understand the idea of an exact concept. The idea of an exact concept they would think of as a mathematical formula, or in worst case a computer simulation, a digitally organized computer simulation. But Riemann would so they would not understand the idea of exact concept, and they would not understand the idea of nature, because when they think of nature, they think of something outside of mankind, as Al Gore does, right? Which is sort of the main thing. They say, well, mankind is destroying nature, as if man is not natural, which is, I guess most people act unnaturally. But the fact of the matter is that nature produced man. So if you're going to understand nature, you have to ask the first question, which is obviously the question that Plato asked, that Kepler asked, that Gauss asked, and that Riemann explicitly asked, and that Lin states over and over and over again. What is it about nature, or the universe as a whole, which generated, or in which the unique power of human beings, which is the creative powers of the human mind, are an efficient power in and over the universe? So you can't discuss nature without discussing the power of the human mind, because and that is what nature is about. That's the most natural thing in nature, is the creative powers of the human mind. So man can't destroy nature, because the creative powers of the human mind is what nature is. That's what nature is. Nature, it's the natural. It's a natural power, as demonstrated by what Lin points to, the fact that mankind, unique among any other species, has demonstrated over the 2 million years of our existence on this planet, where humans have existed as distinct from animals. And by humans you mean biological creatures that possess a power no other animal species does, which is the creative powers of the mind. And that species, i.e. human beings, of which there's only one type of that species. It's not like other animals, which have many different species, a subspecies of, there's lots of different species that are related to each other, but human beings are unique. We're not really related to any other species on the planet, and there's only one of us. And you look at, as Lin's pointed out, of the history of mankind, and man has done what no other species had, which is to increase our population, and the effect of man's population on not just the Earth, but on the universe as a whole. And as he's referred to, Lin has referred to in some of his papers, that you see this already with the man's reaching out to the solar system, and through our astrophysical investigations deep into our galaxy and beyond, which shows us that we have a intergalactic or extragalactic imperative. That man has a imperative to reach out beyond our own galaxy. We don't know what the purpose of that is, but we know that we have that, and that's all that's important, because that itself expresses, probably in a more profound way than anything, that expresses this characteristic of man which distinguishes him from all other creatures. That we have an imperative to increase. We have to have an imperative to increase our power in and over nature, because that's nature. Nature is the development of the development of the increasing powers, creative powers of the human mind. And man has proven this. And how do we do that? We do that by changing, having the capability to change the very relationship of our creative powers to nature itself. And no other creature does that. As Lynn has pointed out, all other species have a fixed relationship with nature. Cows eat grass, polar bears eat seals. I don't know why the environmentalists like polar bears so much. They used to like seals. But have you ever seen a polar bear eat a seal? You know, you don't see that on National Geographic, you know. They always show these cuddly little polar bears, and they say, aren't they cute, floating around on their ice, right? But then show one eating a baby seal, you know, and then people might be less enamored of polar bears. But what's natural is the development of the creative powers of the human mind. Now, that therefore, when the subject of science is precisely that, is that relationship of the creative powers of the human mind in nature. And science is the investigation of the relationship of the mind to the world outside the mind, to the other parts of the universe, and art is the investigation of the relationship of the mind to the mind. And you need both. Now, so we have to develop an exact concept, or a less inexact concept, of that relationship. And that such a concept we would express a finite and self-bounded but unlimited universe. Now, there's another characteristic of such a finite, self-bounded, and unlimited universe, which is expressed by this effect of the creative powers of the human mind, and also in every other part of nature. And that is a characteristic which we give a negative name to, which is anti-entropy. It's not always the best name, because it seems like entropy then must have some significance if you have to be against it. But and this is a source of a lot of confusion, right? Because people say, well, I guess in order to understand anti-entropy, I first have to understand entropy. So in order to understand something that exists, I have to understand something that doesn't exist. But something that doesn't exist, entropy, as a universal principle, understanding entropy will not help you to understand anti-entropy, because you can't say, well, here's what entropy is, and anti-entropy is not entropy. But so we're sort of saddled with that unfortunate term right now. But because you have to use words that people understand to get a concept across, we are at least temporarily stuck with the idea of anti-entropy. But nevertheless, the idea of anti-entropy, when you actually work through the concept, is a adequate name for this idea of that is a characteristic of a finite, self-bounded, but unlimited universe. And you see this as exemplified by man's relationship to nature, because that shows you man's relationship to nature, this increasing power of the creative power of the human mind in and over the universe, is an anti-entropic process. You look at the development of man's relationships with respect to nature, but also with respect to other human beings, with civilization. You have you see a process which goes from a lower state of organization and existence to a higher state of organization of existence. Now, this is not just a characteristic of human beings, but when you investigate every corner of nature, from the very large to the very small, you see that this is the characteristic of the universe itself, which is obviously not surprising, since man is a part of the universe. So how could you have a universe which is generally entropic, that is tending towards some state of disorganization, and you have a process in it which is anti-entropic, which has no effect on the rest of the universe as a whole? It's just an absolute absurdity. And this this term of entropy versus anti-entropy is sort of a modern form in the last 200 years or 150 years that this concept has been discussed, but it goes back in the same form of argument that Philo had against Aristotle or Plato had against the sophists on the question of the creativity. What do you mean by a creative God? Where Aristotle insisted that God was creative, but man is not, and that God created the universe and then left himself out of it, and therefore the universe was just going on, but man, as a creative power, did not have the ability to change to continue the process of creation in the universe itself. Philo argued with Aristotle on this, and so did Plato against the sophists, that the creative powers of the human mind are a demonstration, and this is crucial to recognizing, to being able to do any science, is a demonstration that the universe is, that man's creative powers are a intrinsic aspect of the continuing creation of the universe as a whole. And this, of course, there's all kinds of paradoxes that come up with this, as Plato wrestled with, and others, that, if human creativity is essential to the creative functioning of the universe as a whole, but yet human creativity is a willful process. You can't compel anybody to be creative. You can't give orders to be creative. Creativity is willful. So how can the universe be dependent on the action of something which may or may not occur based on the willfulness, the free will? And you have the free will to not be creative. But as we see from the effect of that, if you exercise the free will not to be creative, the anti-entropic tendency of the universe will let you know it, and will purge that society of its decision to not be creative. But that won't compel anybody to be creative. Fear of collapse will not compel people to do the good. It might frighten people to do less bad, but it won't compel people to do good. What compels people to do good is the good itself, and that requires, that's where you have to turn to the great artists who understand, as Keats so poetically summarized. You have to look at the question of beauty as a scientific principle, and beauty is a scientific principle, which is why both scientists and artists describe discoveries as beautiful. Use the same emotion and the same concept to a discovery of a principle are associated with both science and art. So, but when you look at the experimental evidence, both the evidence that I've expressed, and then when you extend that, this evidence of the increasing power of the human mind, and you extend that to looking at as I said, every corner of the universe, big and small, you see that this anti-entropic characteristic is everywhere in the universe. It's the only way things work. Lynn has pointed, for example, to the idea of the spinning plasma disk, of the formation of the solar system itself, right? As we know from astrophysical investigations, when you look at the development of other stars, you see we have enough astrophysical investigations to see both the formation of stars and also the end of stars. And you see that we don't see other solar systems, although we have evidence of the existence of other solar systems. But when you look at the astrophysical evidence and the formation of a star, you see that these stars all form from a rotating plasma disk, which has not only gas, spinning gas, but has rotation, but it also has an electromagnetic effect where the elements of that gas are electrically charged and have a electromagnetic interaction. And the combination of rotation and electromagnetic interaction, as our evidence of our solar system indicates, then has a tendency to organize itself from the lower state of a rotating plasma gas into the relatively higher state of a star with a solar system. And in our particular case, we see that it has not only a star with a solar system, but a star with a solar system with a planet in that solar system, which had the power to be able to develop life, on which life could develop, and out of which cognitive life could develop. Now, Lin in his new paper has emphasized something which is really crucial when you think about that idea, which is that even though that process, as I described it, describes in a certain sense one view of the evolution of an evolutionary process, it's not the reality, because as Vernadsky points out, life is a distinct principle from non-life. So no matter how much rotation or electromagnetic interaction there existed in that spinning plasma disk, that could not produce life. No matter how much development life produced, and which we understand very little of the mechanism of life itself. But no matter, even with a greater understanding, you cannot explain the emergence of human life as something that exists in living process itself. So that the principle of life and the principle of cognition exist as distinct principles, but as we see from the universe, they're not in a separate world. They are separate, but they're not separate. They're interacting. That the process of life has, over time, transformed the abiotic parts of the earth, and that cognition has transformed abiotic the living process. So the reality is that the cognitive principle is ordering the lower forms to organize themselves to be able to generate the higher forms. It's the higher principle which orders the lower to generate itself so as to increase the power of the higher, not the other way around. It's an idea which will be able to have a more sensuous understanding for when we look at music, that Lin sometimes called the future determining the present. So and that is sort of characteristic of the tendency for anti-entropy. The anti-entropic tendency is a tendency that expresses a higher principle in which the higher principles are organizing the lower principles, not the lower principles organizing the higher. And in the universe, as Lincoln said, cannot be half entropic and half anti-entropic. It has to be all one or all the other. Because if there's any place in the universe that is not changing, then the whole universe is going to be tending towards that point. If the universe is everywhere changing, then it can't be changing towards a point of no change, because then there's a point of the universe which is not changing. So it can't be everywhere changing, but have a place of no change. Just as Kepler showed with the equant, with his refutation of the equant, that the universe didn't just appear to be changing, but somewhere there was some vantage point that if you stood, you could observe what appeared to be an always changing solar system as if it were still. But that no one, not even God, could look at the universe, could find a place in the universe in which you could see no change, a uniform motion. So it's a fundamental distinction. So that change, not only is change a fundamental principle, or exist everywhere, but change has a direction. Change is the general characteristic of change in the universe is of this anti-entropic form. So our concept that we want to sort of hone in on here is a concept of a finite, self-bounded universe which is unlimited and which has the characteristic of anti-entropy. This is not an ideal universe we're creating. This is the real universe that we're living in, as I think we've indicated. Anything else is a fantasy world of an unreal universe, so it's not worth investigating. Now, that's obviously the only thing that's worth investigating in science is the real universe. I don't know why anybody would want to waste their time with some alternative universe. But so a universe which is anti-entropic doesn't exist. A universe, a Euclidean world which goes on forever doesn't exist. There's no evidence. So why should we even bother thinking about that? But in terms of the real universe, it has this characteristic, but simply stating those words does not give us an exact concept of what we mean by that. We have to develop a more precise idea of what we mean by a finite, self-bounded, and unlimited universe that is anti-entropic. Now, the approach that I propose to look at this, I mentioned in the pedagogy, is Riemann's approach, Riemann's general approach to science as well, which is not unique to Riemann, but is actually the approach to science that is the approach from which all scientific principles, all scientific breakthroughs have occurred. And that is why, to understand Riemann's approach, the most efficient way to understand Riemann's approach is to take the narrow educational program that Lynn is specified of Kepler, Gauss, and Riemann. And I think, though, for pedagogical purposes, Riemann's final work on the mechanism of the ear is a very good pedagogical one to investigate or to use to have a platform from which we can actually model or approach this development of an exact concept of a finite, self-bounded, and unlimited universe with an anti-entropic characteristic. Now, this, of course, was his last paper, which he never finished. He didn't intend it to be his last paper. He was very young when he died. He was only 40 years old. And if you look at just Riemann's life, you see that most of his work occurred. He died in 1865, but almost all his work, major published works, occurred in a single decade, between 1851 and 1861. Almost all his major breakthroughs. So in that very short 10-year period, Riemann's almost everything we associate with Riemann's discoveries was accomplished in that very short period of time. Had he lived, there would have been many more accomplishments. But he became ill. He had this tuberculosis, and that cut down on his productivity, and it required him to spend long periods of time in Italy, where the climate was warmer and less damp than in northern Germany, and which also was kind of interesting because it enabled him to develop some collaborators in Italy, which later made some very important contributions to the extension of Riemann's work. But he had turned to a investigation. Here's a man who all his previous works had focused on investigations of the so-called abiotic domain, or phenomena in the abiotic domain, to a biological process. And the first question is, why was he interested in this? Well, it wasn't really that unique. This is a tradition which goes back to Da Vinci. If you look at Da Vinci's work, Da Vinci was investigating. Da Vinci was always doing work on both life and so-called abiotic processes. But it was in that tradition that some of Riemann's closest collaborators were. Wilhelm Weber, whose work on electromagnetism was so important, had done a major study on the human walking apparatus. Because what physicists of Riemann's stature and Riemann circles were interested in at the time was to try to recognize what Vernadsky later made explicit, that to understand the abiotic world, you cannot separate it from the biotic. So he took the example of the ear and looked at the mechanism of the ear, which to not only investigate how the ear worked, of which his work was not conclusory, but to demonstrate an approach by which you have to look at investigate how a abiotic process works, which is, say, for example, in this case, the propagation of sound. Now, Riemann had done some study on the propagation of sound, which is what his shockwave paper was about. And but when you look at the ear, and that has some very interesting implications, but when you look at the development of the ear, you see something that calls into question a mechanistic and reductionist explanation of a abiotic process, in this case the propagation of sound. And Riemann explicitly states that, because the common idea of the propagation of sound is that it's a mechanical, a push-me, pull-me effect of propagation of a wave in a compressible medium, i.e. air. So that because the air, unlike a fluid, unlike a liquid, can be compressed, you can transmit a wave action through the air by a mechanical process of successively compressing and decompressing air. And this is sort of a mechanistic example of air, that you get a string vibrating, and the vibrating string then disturbs the air, and the air pushes the air, and the air pushes the air, and the air pushes the air, and you get a wave propagating through that. And that was sort of the mechanical explanation that Newton, Descartes, and basically most people at Helmholtz had come to accept. Yeah.
So just culturally, you said that there was a general understanding of trying to look at abiotic processes from biotic, and what other scientists or what else were they?
Well, I mentioned one, like Weber. Weber did this whole study on how the human being walks, because it's quite puzzling. He actually was reworking on Da Vinci's work, but Da Vinci was doing this too. If you look at Da Vinci's studies of anatomy and also his studies of plants, and you look, that's what he's actually trying to understand. But you could get so it's really prevalent. It's not as unusual as one might expect, but you can get exactly to the point, because Riemann is very explicit as to what he's doing here, because he says, because Helmholtz had this idea, and what was generally accepted is that you had this percussive effect of the sound in the air, and that air wave eventually hit another medium, a solid medium of the eardrum, this tympanic membrane, which then was attached to three solid bones, the anvil, stirrup, and hammer of the inner ear, of the middle ear, which then set into motion another membrane, an inner tympanic membrane, which then set into motion a vibration in a fluid in the cochlea, in the inner ear, and that vibrated these hairs in the cochlea, which then resonated with the frequency of the airwave, and somehow that resonating vibration was transmitted to the brain and interpreted as perception of sound. Now, and that was what was accepted by Helmholtz, and generally accepted as sort of a mechanical explanation of how the ear worked, and also how sound worked. Now, Riemann raised the obvious question, which is, well, that we have to start with what does the ear actually do, and not try and explain how the ear works based on a assumption of a mechanistic assumption of how sound works. But let's look at what the ear actually does, and then try, as he said, reinvent it, so to speak, to see how it does what it does. And what it does is not something that's open to speculation, it's something that is experimentally determined. And he raises a couple of examples, such as the ability of the ear to transmit sound in such a way that we can understand a piece of music. How do we actually take, if all the ear was transmitting this mechanical vibrations, how would we be able to actually pick out the different tones of a musical piece and actually understand that as a piece of music? Or in hearing languages, that we can actually hear very subtle changes in pronunciations, especially in vowel sounds, with languages that we can understand. And everybody's obviously familiar with this, that you can understand very subtle variations in vowel sounds in a language you're familiar with, and you can't in a language you're not familiar with. You know, if you're a native English speaker, you can go to all parts of the USA and the world and hear English spoken with all kinds of wild accents, and you can understand it's English, right? Whereas somebody who's not a native English speaker might be able to detect a certain accent, but they come to California and they can't understand what people are saying. But then you can't pick out very subtle variations that people who speak a language you don't can understand. So it's not just the pitch. It's not just the frequency of the sound which your ear is able to distinguish. The other example Riemann uses is the volume as well. There was a well-known experiment of detecting a foghorn in England from as far as 20 miles away, and on a humid night where the air was humid and sound traveled. But if you tried to calculate the effect of that wave, how its impact diminished over such a long distance, by the time it reached the ear, it was so weak that the vibration of the air due to that sound was less than the ambient vibration of the air inside the ear canal. So Riemann says, so obviously the ear can do something. It has the ability to pick out sounds, weak sounds out of this ambient. You don't hear the air rustling around inside your ear, but you can detect a very clear sound. Or another example is when you have a recording device, such as a contact microphone, in a room. You hear all the noise in the room when you hear the recording, but when you were there, you didn't hear all the noise in the room because you were able to pick this out. So this is something your ear is able to do. Distinguish the much more finer distinguishing of the characteristic of sound than a mechanistic explanation. As Riemann puts it, the ear can obviously detect vibrations that cannot be detected by a microscope. So the mechanism of the ear is more sensitive and more complex than any machine we can make. It can do something that no machine we can make can do. And this is done as a biological process. So life can organize material to produce a mechanism which can interact with an abiotic process, sound, in a way that non-life can't. And so Riemann's point was, let's investigate for science how life does that. Now, he died before the paper was finished, so he never actually answers that question, but that's the question he posed. And that question is obviously relevant in a general form of method from the standpoint of what we're trying to look at with what is this finite, self-bounded, but unlimited universe with an anti-entropic characteristic, because that's what the universe actually does. So let's start with what it actually does. How does it do that? Well, it does that, as we've already indicated, and as Lynn has emphasized, by this interaction between these three domains and the fourth domain, which is the interaction of human creativity in a social way. Because the individual creative output of a human mind does not directly interact with the biotic and abiotic parts of the universe. The creative powers of the mind interact with the biotic and abiotic parts through a social interaction among human creative minds, both in terms of contemporaries of people, but also past and future generations. That's what we call culture. That is, the creative powers of the mind interact through another domain, which is culture, which is how ideas get communicated from one generation to another. How a human being today can assimilate the discoveries, the significant discoveries of 3,000 years of human history in just part of a single life. So we act on our effect on the biotic and abiotic parts of the universe is through interaction in this fourth domain, which is the social interaction of ideas. So therefore we have to understand how minds interact with other minds as well. And we have to start the way Riemann does. That this shows us something about the nature of the universe actually does this, and so that's what the kind of concept we have to form with respect to the way Riemann tried to do it with respect to the ear. Now, what is it about the principle of life? And in effect, Riemann was saying, what is it about the principle of life, about what the ear can do with sound, cannot be understood simply by a mechanistic idea of the ear, but also by a mechanistic idea of sound. Or another way to think about it is that sound must have a certain characteristic to it that could be utilized by biology so that a human mind can interact with the universe in the audible domain, as in addition to the domain of vision and our other senses. And Riemann was just picking the ear. He had also poses the idea of that the same thing could be studied by investigating the eye, which is something that Kepler actually started to do. Kepler made some major discoveries on how the eye works, because he was trying to understand this question of light. Because if you're doing astronomy, what are you doing? You're studying light. Your knowledge of the motions of the heavenly bodies is changes in position of light. And we know that, and how do you know what the light is doing? Is through your eye. So Kepler said, well, if I'm going to understand how light works, how the planets move, I have to understand how the eye works. Because what I'm seeing is what I think of the solar system, of these planets, I'm gaining through my interaction with them, but through my eyes. So if I don't know how my eye works, how do I know what is actually happening, what I'm actually reacting to? So he did some stuff on the eye, which Riemann doesn't reference Kepler, but in his introduction he says, a similar approach could be taken to investigating the eye. Now, this is what Riemann doesn't say, but what I think this fits in very closely with is Couza's idea, which he discusses in many places, but the one I like is on Searching for God, where Kuza discusses this question of perception. That is, perception comes to your you perceive things, such as light activates the retina, but that's not sufficient to give you vision, because that you need a higher faculty that can take the stimulation of the retina and form an image out of that. And you need a still higher faculty to be able to recognize that image as something associated with a universal idea, and to compare that image with other images. And you need a still higher faculty to be able to look at be able to go from that image to the principles that generate and govern that image. And that requires a still higher faculty, and Kuza gives these names: intellect, understanding, rationality, and that requires the higher faculty of man participating in God. That is, you have to, in order for man to actually see anything, perceive anything, he perceives things as part of the process of continuing creation of the universe. And that's what vision is. Vision is a means by which, so he builds this up in this bottom-up way, starting with the stimulation of the retina up to these higher faculties, but says the way it really works is the other way. That vision is the continuing creative process of the universe acting through man and to create the capacity for visual perception in order to for those higher faculties to act on the universe as a whole.
Okay, Bruce.
Mm-hmm.
Are you just saying, Kuza as an example of how he's also playing with the senses? Like Kepler was also experimenting with the eye to try out what Riemann was doing with the ear. This is another example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Kuza's method, yeah, that's why I'm saying Riemann doesn't explicitly cite Kuza, but I think if you look at Kuza, you can see why Riemann is really in that same tradition, because in effect Riemann is saying is in order to understand sound, you have to understand the purpose of sound, and the purpose of sound is it's an interaction of a creative process with the universe outside. So it's the biological, it's the power of life and the power of cognition, which actually is the reason for sound to act the way it does. So sound must have a characteristic in it. Its essential nature must be an essential nature of the of participating in the creative process. Or another way to think about it is, as Linda said, we interact with the world through our senses, particularly vision and hearing, but that is not the world. And our vision and our hearing are investigating the same universe, but they tell us different things about the same universe. So you can't rely on either vision or hearing, but you have to look at vision and hearing as they interact with the mind's attempt to get a greater power in and over the universe as a whole. This, of course, obviously goes back. This is consistent with the approach of the Pythagoreans and the approach of the Pythagoreans and the Greeks, and all the way up through Da Vinci and Kuza and so on and so forth. Now, and it's also the approach that Kepler takes, right? When Kepler looks at the planetary orbits, his first question, as he states in the Mysterium, is the fundamental point here is that the organization of the solar system must be consistent with the ability of mankind to discover that principle of organization in the solar system. And that therefore the solar system must be organized according to principles that man would find beautiful. He has that beautiful quote where he says, it's as if God looked to man who was yet to be. and constructed the world according to those principles, as if nature were imitating art. So it's that obviously God had the power to construct the universe according to any principle he wanted. But he also created man with a creative power. So he embedded in the universe that the principles on which the universe acts would be organized according to the same principles, according to the same characteristics that a creative process would require to be able to understand and act on those principles. And he makes that first discovery that the first approximation that this ordering is consistent with the 5 regular solids. Now, this idea of that these characteristics of the principles have to conform to the characteristics of a creative mind is what, in general, is meant by the idea of harmonics, harmonic characteristics. Because there's a lot of, I think Kepler is quite, and this is where you're probably going to get more into it as you get into the harmonies, because the harmonies of the world, because Kepler really deals with this question of harmonic characteristics. What he means by harmonic characteristics is not musical tones that sound good with each other, but he means the general form. As he emphasizes, the term harmonia is what the Latin speakers call congruence, which is an expression of how things fit together. And here's another example of having to explain an idea with a word that it's the idea is separate from the word. The word has come to be associated with the idea because of the principle of the idea, but the idea existed before being associated with this particular word. My good friend David Shavin has pointed out to me that in his research of Greek language, that the common use of the term harmonia it wasn't a word that was used to refer to artistic or scientific investigations. It was a common word, and it simply meant how things fit together. It means to fit together. But when you think about it, it's the appropriate word for what we're talking about, the concept we're talking about, because how things fit together as a function of a concept or of a principle. And the example that is commonly used, which David has pointed out, which I've used many times, is how does boards fit together to make a boat? The boards are of all different length, and they have to be curved and shaped and cut and so forth in order to be able to accomplish what the purpose of the boat is. If it's a cargo boat, it has to have a certain shape. If it's a warship, or if it's going to move fast, depending on what the mission of that boat is. So there's a certain concept that a human mind has about hydrodynamic principles. And in order to conquer those hydrodynamic principles, or to put those hydrodynamic principles at the service of mankind, those principles demand that boards fit together in a certain way in order to make a boat. If you fit the boards together in a different way, you're not going to. The hydrodynamic principles will say that's not harmonic. The boat will sink, right? It won't be watertight. It won't move. It won't do anything it has to do. So the principles, the acting principles, which are continuous. They're continuous principles, they're acting everywhere, they're universal, demand a certain harmonic characteristic, which we express in the way the boat is putting together. That's a very simple metaphorical way to understand how this term of harmonic characteristics works. And Kepler points out in the New Astronomy that this is how the universe works. It is the fact that the planets are where they are is because that's the certain harmonic character, that's a reflection. Those are the harmonic characteristics that the principle that organized the solar system required. Now, you don't see those principles. You see the harmonic characteristics. And so you identify the nature of that principle by the harmonic characteristics. And that's what we mean by harmonic characteristics. And Kepler, of course, as the Greeks did, got us to look at this term in general, both from the standpoint of vision as well as from the standpoint of hearing. So from the standpoint of vision, he talks in the harmonies about the harmonics, for example, of a circle compared to the harmonics of a sphere, and the harmonics of a flat surface versus the harmonics of a spherical surface. So the harmonics of a circle, you see, are associated with the regular divisions of the circle. That is, when you're talking about the division of a circle into 2 parts, 5 parts, or any polygon, the circle, you're not building it up corner by corner. You're not saying, well, where would the first corner be, and then make the second corner and the third corner and fourth corner and so forth. You're taking the entire circle, which is a self-bounded manifold, not the inside, but just the circle itself. It's a self-bounded circle, and the circle is self-bounded, but so it appears to be the same everywhere. But it has the principle of circular action, has certain harmonic characteristics, which you discover as soon as you try to divide the circle into harmonic parts, harmonically. You make things fit together inside a circle. And to make a polygon fit in a circle, you find that, well, you can get harmonies which are consistent with doubling, dividing in half and in half and in half and in half and in half, and that can be accomplished using one that has a certain harmonics, but those harmonics, no matter how far you continue that process out, will never divide the circle into 3 parts. So now we have not just one harmonic characteristic, but we have 2 different harmonic characteristics which the circle demands. The principle of circular action demands 1 harmonics for 2, another harmonic for 3, and then you run into a problem, because if you can divide the whole circle into 3 parts, but you can't divide the third into 3 parts, using magnitudes that are knowable from the circle and the circumference. And then you get a similar boundary at 5, and then, as Kepler thought, at 7 and beyond. Gauss later showed that Kepler didn't. There was a higher harmonic which Kepler didn't see, right? So what the harmonic divisions of the circle give us is a concept. You could begin to see of a concept of a self-bounded manifold, because the circle has no edges, right? But that self-bounded manifold has a a harmonic characteristic to it, which is changing, and each harmonic characteristic is separated from the other by a boundary which is external to that characteristic. That is, there's nothing in dividing the circle in half and in half and in half and in half and in half that would indicate to you that dividing it in thirds would require something different. But you find that boundary when you try and do it. And you see that dividing it in half and in half and in half is unlimited. You can go forever on it, right? But there's a boundary. Because no matter how unlimited, no matter how far you take out that process, you're never going to divide the circle into 3 parts. So it's an image of a concept of an externally bounded, but self-bounded, but unlimited, but externally bounded harmonic characteristic. Right? Then when you look at as Kepler points out, the harmonics of the sphere, then you get a different story altogether. because the harmonics of the sphere, the equal harmonics, certain harmonic divisions, you get the 5 regular solids, and then you get the harmonics of the Archimedean, and that's bounded, because you can't get more than 5. And if you do the construction, both Kepler's construction, but then later look at it from the standpoint of Gauss, you can know exactly why there's a boundary. Here you've got this sphere, which is everywhere continuous, always the same, no differentiations to it. But it has in it this boundary, and you can prove to yourself that existence of that boundary, that there are 5 and only 5. You're not going to make a 6th regular solid. But there's another set of harmonics, the Archimedean solids, which also have a boundary to them. And then you have other processes which extend the possibility of these further solids, the divisions of these other harmonic solids. And when you go through the harmonies, and especially what the youth did on the harmonies website, they have a good investigation of those harmonic relationships. So the harmonics of the sphere are different, right? But what are the 5 regular solids? Are they the objects which determine how the sphere can be divided? Or are they the effect of an unseen principle who expresses its harmonics in the visible domain in a certain way? Right? So they express the spherical harmonics, express themselves in to the eye in a certain way. And then when you look, as Gauss did with the pentagram of Mirificum, you see that spherical harmonics actually are subsumed by a higher form of harmonics called elliptical harmonics. And the elliptical harmonics are subsumed in a higher form which Riemann later dealt with. And we can go through some examples of that later. But in the same way that your eye then gives you insights into the nature of physical principles by the harmonics of vision, your ear also can detect other harmonics which contradict the ones that your eye hears. And we can do a simple example of that if Eric pulls out his cello. Do you have it here? Right. Well, actually, yeah, I'll do it just because it's. I can actually do it, Eric. So.
You got it?
Yeah, I'll just stand it up on here, and I think people can see. It'll be easier. So, all right. So we have a string here. Now we're not talking about music. We're just talking about an abiotic process. We're just talking about a string, right? Now, to your eye, the string is a straight line, right? It's like the diameter of the circle, not the circumference. Right? Now, when you divide a straight line into 2 parts, it's the same method as dividing it into 3 parts, or 5 parts, or 7 parts, or 50 parts, or 1 billion parts. So there's nothing in the division of the diameter of the circle that expresses to the eye anything that's consistent with the harmonics that the circumference of the circle expresses to the eye. But when your ear investigates the string, the straight line, well, let me. Yeah, well, no, just hold this cup of water. I just don't want to knock water off. Okay, so here you hear that tone, the string. As I say, we're not talking about music. But when I touch that string at a certain place, you hear that ringing sound, right? It's called a harmonic. But when I touch the string in a different place, say right here, you don't hear that same ring. It's not as clear, right? And if I touch the string, if I just move it, let me do it. Hear how it goes in and out of a harmonic sound. It's really fun to do this on a string bass because you have much more harmonics.
Are you doing the same thing all the way?
Yeah, I'm just touching the string very lightly and just running the bow across the string. So there are certain places for example those. Get that harmonic characteristic, right? And those harmonic characteristics, even though these strings have different fundamental pitches, it's in the same place relative to the length of the string. Okay? Now, there you go. So what you see that your ear now tells you something about the division of the string that your eye can't. Your ear can detect a harmonic division of the string that your eye cannot detect. And when you look at these harmonic divisions, where those harmonic divisions of the string are, that is where the string does that, where your ear can hear those things, those correspond to combinations that of the harmonic divisions of the circle, which Kepler says, following the Greeks, are knowable, are based on magnitudes that are knowable by the circumference and the diameter of the circle, or the so-called straight edge and compass constructions, right? So to your eye, the string appears straight. But to your ear, it appears curved. Because your ear can detect a curvature underlying the principle of the string. But your eye can't see that. Your eye can't look at the string and determine where the harmonics are. You can only detect it with your ear. And what your ear hears is not a straight line. What your ear hears is a circle. And you hear that circle in the form of the octaves, which are like circular rotations. And each circular rotation has internally harmonic divisions, which are the same. And those harmonic divisions, your ear can hear, and they correspond to what your eye sees when it tries to divide a circle. So is the string straight or curved? Well, it's straight, right? Because you can't vibrate a curved string. If you put a string into a circle, how could you make a tone? In order to apply a tension across the string, you have to bound the string by the bridge and the nut. So it's externally bounded. It's not a self-bounded process, right? But that externally bounded process has a harmonics in it. But the circle itself, in effect, must be externally bounded because it has a harmonic divisions, And it has a harmonic relationships among those harmonic divisions. That is, it has the harmonic divisions related to 2, 3, 5, and then you get into what Gauss did with the divisions of the circle, and there are harmonics within those harmonics. So if you want to understand the nature of these principles, you have to look to both senses, for example, to get this sense of harmonics. Harmonics of vision, harmonics of sound. Now, and now these are very simple examples of harmonics. But the harmonics of the physical universe are more complicated than these simple examples. And you see this in the case of Kepler with the harmonies. In the case of Kepler, Kepler starts with the idea, what is the harmonic characteristics that determine why there are 5 planets, visible planets, and why are they where they are? And he shows that they correspond to the harmonic divisions of the sphere. But then the experimental evidence says, but if they correspond to the harmonic divisions of the sphere, then the orbits would be circular. But when I look at the planets are speeding up and slowing down. And as you know from the new astronomy, Kepler shows that the planets are not just speeding up and slowing down, appearing to be speeding up and slowing down, but they are speeding up and slowing down. And there is no equant. And then Kepler says, well, what would make the planet speed up and slow down? And that's where he comes to his idea of the orbit must have a form in which its distance from the sun is always getting greater or less, which is affecting its speed. And that, as you know from working through the new astronomy, he struggles to discover is an actual elliptical form. Now you don't see, your eyes do not tell you that this is an elliptical orbit. What you see is a circular orbit on the inside of the celestial sphere. But your mind shows you that this is an elliptical orbit, right? But that poses the next question, which is why these ellipses and not some other ellipses? Because the 5 regular solids gives you a harmonic division for circular orbits. But why are these ellipses? Even if you try and approximate it with the 5 regular solids, there's still an infinite number of ellipses that would come close to the 5 regular solids. Because a circle varies from another circle simply by size. But an ellipse varies from another ellipse by size and eccentricity. So the manifold of all circles is much less dense, because you can only have one variation. But the manifold of all ellipses is much more dense. There's more potential for development in a manifold of ellipses, because you can have ellipses which have the same axis, but whose eccentricity is different. So there's a greater density of action in a manifold of ellipses. So how do you determine these ellipses? What's the principle? So I don't think I'm giving away the secret to tell you that Kepler looked at what were the places in the physics of the harmonics of the planetary orbits that caused the what were the physics of the planetary orbits that would form harmonics. So Kepler looks at the elliptical orbit, said, well, here you got an orbit which is everywhere changing. It is always speeding up and slowing down. So you can't pick an arbitrary point, because every point is changing, is different than any other one. But if it's always speeding up and then always slowing down, there are 2 points in which the way it's changing is changing. That's the aphelion and the perihelion, the minimum and maximum speeds. And those minimum and maximum speeds tune what happens in the orbit. Because how much the planet has to speed up from the slowest speed to the fastest speed, and how much it has to slow down, is a function of what the proportions of those 2 speeds are. So the orbit is tuned by the minimum and maximum speeds. Now, what tunes the tuners? That's what Kepler asked. Now, to figure that out, he spent a lot of time trying to look for that within a given planetary orbit, and it didn't work. And he eventually realized that it's the relationship among the neighboring planets. so that the planets are tuned by a harmonic relationship among the planetary orbits as a whole, and that harmonic relationship, as Kepler demonstrates, cannot be visibly seen, but are the harmonics that our ear can hear. But they're not the harmonics of the vibrating string, because he exhaustively goes through the boundaries of the harmonics of the vibrating string in Book 3. These are the harmonics which are more complicated. And they are the harmonics that human beings need to compose polyphonic music. But Kepler was not a composer, so he didn't actually, he said he showed what these harmonics were, but he didn't show what the principle they reflect is, because that principle cannot be discovered in the domain of astrophysics. It can only be discovered in the domain of artistic musical composition. And later we'll turn to the Bach in order to illustrate that. So I think you can begin to see, and there's obviously, I'm being very cursory in my steps here, because I'm just trying to point to some signposts that you'll find along the way. That to get a concept of this, of the characteristic of the universe, a universe which is finite, self-bounded, but unlimited, with an anti-entropic characteristic, the way that expresses itself to us is as a harmonic relationships. And those are harmonics which both our ear and our eye tells us. Now, we can point to this other one later. All right, now, so now you see that the harmonics, the harmonic characteristics, if you have the bounding principles, the bounding conditions, what physicists would call boundary conditions, produces a harmonic characteristic within produce harmonic characteristics, which are harmonic characteristics among what physicists might refer to as discontinuities or singularities. Places where the action of the principle changes. So in the case of the elliptical orbits of the planets, it's not where the speed of the planet is changing, because the speed of the planet is always changing, but it's where the change changes. Because the planet always has a speed, and at every point its speed is either increasing from the one before or decreasing. But from the moment before. But at the point at which the change changes, then what is the planet's speed doing? Is it speeding up or slowing down? Right? Now, it doesn't mean the planet doesn't know what it's doing at that point. Don't get into quantum physics here. The planet knows exactly what it's doing. But to our vision, to our minds, to our ears, that change of change expresses itself as a place where the characteristic of action changes. And we simply call that a singularity. There's no big mystery of what a singularity is. Don't look for a mathematical investigation, a mathematical explanation of it. It's a discontinuity. It's when the way things are happening changes. And it doesn't change slowly. It's the point at which there's a change in the change. I mean, the planet is speeding up, and then it starts slowing down. There's one point where it makes a change in the change. There's nothing in between speeding up and slowing down. It doesn't have any moment where it's doing something else than those two things. It's the moment of change. So that's a discontinuity. It's the place where the change changes. And it's the discontinuities, or in the case of the string, where you get the harmonics, those are discontinuities, where the general characteristic of the vibration of the string changes, and you get that clear tone. Okay. So you're talking about a harmonic characteristic among discontinuities, among the singularities. They're ordered by a harmonic principle, which in turn orders the general characteristic of the action. Right? So you have, for example, with the planet. It's the singularities which tune what the planet is doing everywhere else. And the solar system tunes what the planet is doing at every moment by tuning the singularities. Now, Gauss and Riemann then extend that idea one step further, which to grasp you have to look at both vision and hearing. From the vision standpoint, you can see this by thinking of, okay, how do you change the harmonic characteristic among the singularities? It can, if we're talking about a universe which is finite but bounded, so it has harmonic characteristics because it's bounded. Even though it's self-bounded, there's still a boundary condition. There are principles which are acting, and they're acting according to certain principles, and the boundary, the principles express themselves in the visible in the created world by harmonic characteristics. But if our universe is, if the universe simply were that, then it wouldn't be unlimited. Because there would be a set of harmonic characteristics. How could, if it's unlimited, those harmonic characteristics have to be able to be changed? Now, Riemann comes to develop an idea which can express for us such a concept of a manifold in which the harmonics are changing. A manifold of harmonic characteristics in which the harmonics are changing. And he develops this idea out of the work of Gauss and on curvature and on the divisions of the circle, and also on the numbers. I indicated a bunch of these things in the pedagogy, and if there are specific questions, I'll go into some details, but otherwise I think you'll have some fun working through these things on your own. But let me just indicate, one or two maybe examples to try and illustrate this, the way Riemann is developing it. He develops this under the investigation of what he refers to as the P function. Now, everybody looks at the P function and say, well, what is the P function? And Riemann is not talking about a mathematical expression. What he means, but what he's referring to when he's talking about the P function is a manifold of manifolds in which the harmonic characteristics are changing according to an increasing density of singularities. And so let me just give you give you a sort of a very, very sketchy little insight into how Riemann thinks about this. If you go back to what we were talking about with the spherical functions, the harmonics of the sphere. You take the harmonics of the sphere, and you see that the harmonics of the sphere have, well, you've got some examples up there. These regular and semi-regular solids are the harmonics of the sphere. And there's an interesting, those are all different harmonics, right? And those harmonics are characterized by if you can think of, say, the number of faces or the number of vertices or the number of edges of any one of those divisions, harmonic divisions of the sphere, it's the singularity, it's the number of those vertices, faces, and edges which determine which sort of express the harmonic characteristics, right? What distinguishes the five regular solids one from another is that those you can have, for example, you could take a spherical square or a spherical triangle, and you can have a spherical triangle of varying size. But unlike on a plane, the bigger the triangle, the greater the angles. Whereas on a plane, you can have triangles of different size, and those triangles can all have the same angles, right? Like you can have an equilateral triangle on a sphere, on a plane, that can be any size, right? But on a sphere, there are only 3 possible equilateral triangles. You can take a triangle and you can try and make it equilateral by making the sides bigger or smaller. Am I right on that? Well, let me back off from that point. But on the sphere, as you make the triangle bigger, the number of angles get bigger. But there are only 3 equilateral triangles on the sphere that when you cover the sphere with triangles of that size, you'll come to the cycle will close. And you'll get a complete covering of the sphere, as opposed to some overlapping, right? And then if you add, so that complete covering will produce on the surface of the sphere a harmonic number of vertices, faces, and edges. Right? And if you then start mixing spherical polygons, you can increase the number of potential harmonic divisions of the sphere as measured by the number of vertices, faces, and edges. Now, however, no matter how you divide that sphere, whether harmonically or completely irregularly, the number of vertices minus the number of faces plus the number of edges will always equal 2. That's kind of surprising, right? In other words, the curvature of the sphere, the principle of spherical action, demands and permits only certain harmonic divisions. Those harmonic divisions are respected by these singularities, the vertices, faces, and edges. And you can only increase them or decrease them in certain ways. But no matter how you increase or decrease them, or any arbitrary divisions of the sphere, completely irregular, the vertices minus the faces plus the edges will always equal 2. So we have a potential for a large amount of harmonic changes in harmonic characteristics. But now we've found a boundary condition under which those harmonic characteristics will not change. So you have a lot of variation of potential harmonics, but you have something which is like reaching in from somewhere, which is making sure that whatever those harmonic divisions are, the total number of singularities will always add up and subtract to this number 2. Now, because the number is just a number, it's also often referred to as the Euler characteristic. But that has not a reflection on the significance of the principle, just because Euler happened to spend some time counting up these vertices minus faces and edges. Okay. Yeah.
Did you say that the number of faces plus the number of vertices minus edges?
The number of vertices minus the number of faces plus the number of edges.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure I got that right. Okay. Now, however, as we pointed out with the Pentagramma Mirificum, and there's a good set of pedagogicals up on the limb site by Ben Deniston and Megan Roulard when they were in the attic on the Pentagramma. So you can go through that. And that's another thing that when you get into the Pentagramma, you're going to go for a long time on a lot of interesting things. The Pentagramma shows you that embedded in the character of spherical action is also the elliptical action. That the characteristic of the sphere is not spherical, but there's a higher principle that expresses itself in the harmonics of the sphere. Doesn't express itself in the regular solids or semi-regular solids, but it expresses itself in a more general investigation of the sphere, which Napier discovered, called the pentagram of mirificum. And Gauss showed that that pentagram of mirificum had an elliptical characteristic, not a circular one, which is quite surprising because a sphere has the character that if you slice the sphere in any way, it will always make a circle. But how come the fundamental action on a sphere produces an elliptical characteristic, produces a pentagram function, which produces an elliptical characteristic? Now, okay. Which produces this elliptical characteristic. Now, Gauss and Riemann looked at the difference between elliptical action and spherical or circular action. Riemann and Abel and Jacobi made this explicit. Gauss did it in his notebooks, and which the Gauss group is working through some of the work that Gauss did on looking at what is the fundamental difference between the elliptical action and the spherical action. So there's a whole deep domain in this regard, but I'll just indicate it to you in very general terms. That if you look at the circular function, the circular action, you have a characteristic that the circular action has a simple incommensurability to it. As if you have a circle and you look at the circular function of the sine and the cosine, that the angle is always commensurable with the arc. That is, as the rotation here is 1/5 the circle, or the angle will be 1/5. If it's 1/4, the angle will be 1/4. The arc and the angle will always be incommensurable, but the sine or the cosine will vary incommensurably with the arc and the angle. In the case of an ellipse, and with many other things, that is not true. In the case of the ellipse, the arc and the angle are also incommensurable with each other. And the sine and the cosine are incommensurable in yet another way. So the elliptical action, what Gauss and Riemann later realized, which is that the elliptical action is characterized by a double incommensurability. Double periodicity and double incommensurability. Now, this has become known as elliptical action because it's done in the context of the ellipse. But as I've written about in many pedagogies, even all kinds of things like a swinging pendulum and everything else, all are all have the effect of this double periodicity, this double transcendental action. So in fact, Riemann actually reverses the definition, whereas up to Riemann, people said elliptical functions are doubly periodic, and so are this function, and so is that function, and so is this function, so is that function. Riemann just said, forget it, let's go the other way. Doubly transcendental, the primary characteristic is simple periodicity, double periodicity. One transcendental, one commensurability, double incommensurability. One way to think about this, as will become more clear when we go into the music, is think about this as a single voice and the ellipse as being two voices. when you have a two-voice polyphony, right? The music is not conveyed by the first voice or the second voice. It's conveyed by the combined interaction of both voices. A two-voice polyphony is not the sum total of two voices. It's a single voice which has two parts. So it takes two people to sing it. Right? So think of this as sort of a two-part invention, and this is a single invention. Okay? And in terms of a rough approximation, right?
Can you say that again?
Just think of the circular action as being like a single voice. It's this single incommensurability between the sine and the cosine, but the arc and the angle are always one. But in the ellipse, you've got the arc is doing something different than the angle, and it's also doing something different than the sine. So you have two voices that make up this elliptical motion. Right? They each have, they're not arbitrary. They're each singing their line, right? And they each sing their line in a harmonic relationship with each other so as to produce an elliptical motion. So whether you get an ellipse or a swinging pendulum or some other physical process is in effect measured simply by the polyphony of two transcendental actions. That's the most general form of it. Of these two transcendental actions. Now, what Riemann did by using Leibniz's principle of analysis situs, similar to the way Gauss applied it in the fundamental theorem of algebra, but he said, well, we can, since this is the fundamental characteristic we're investigating, we can express this fundamental characteristic by a visual harmonic. Just like Gauss did his surfaces, he said, I can express the fundamental characteristic of an algebraic function by creating a surface whose geometry can vary wildly, but one thing won't vary, which is the shape of the number of humps that it has. So Riemann says, well, Riemann was looking at this question of the elliptical functions, and Abel looked at this as well and said, well, we can also define functions which have three voices, three voice functions, or four voice functions, or five voice functions. And what he found is actually they go up in twos. So elliptical functions are doubly, and if you don't add one more, but you always get two. In any case, he said, well, we can think of this from the standpoint of a geometrical expression. And the geometrical expression, the varying characteristic of this geometrical expression is the what he called the genus or the species of a surface, so that a simply periodic function can be expressed on a spherical surface, and a doubly periodic function, a two-voice function, has to be expressed on a surface that has the potential to support two voices. And a sphere cannot support two voices, because on a sphere, if you have one voice, it's going to completely take up the whole sphere. But if you have a torus, like a donut, now you can have two voices can sing on a torus. They can't sing on a sphere, because one voice can sing this way, and the other voice can sing that way. And then you can get two voices singing together, and they make up the whole surface of the torus. Right? And if you have another surface that has two holes in it, now you can have three voices singing. Because you can have one voice that sings this way, another voice that sings that line, and another voice that sings that line. So you can have three distinct voices. So in this way, you can conceive of, and I'm being very summary here just to illustrate a particular point of this relationship. You can illustrate in a summary way, a visual image of a manifold, each one of which is self-bounded, right? The sphere, the torus, and these higher surfaces, they're all self-bound. They have no edges, they have no boundaries, but they have this singularities in them because they're different from one to another because they can support an extra voice. And there's a discontinuous process from being a one voice to a two voice. You can't have a 1.5 voice fugue, right? You either got two voices or one. You either got three or four. You can't have a half a voice, right? Now, there's many ways that Riemann showed how this succession of visual manifolds, which are self-bounded, express the potential for an increasing density of harmonic characteristics. Well, one is a very simple one, which I'll just illustrate to you right now. Which is, okay, you take a torus. What are the harmonic divisions of the torus? We can have harmonic divisions on a torus just as we can on a sphere. I mean, we can make a real simple one, right? You have, if you just take a curve this way and one this way and then one over here. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, sort of like a toroidal, like a toroidal octahedron.
It would be curved though, right?
Yeah, these are on the surface, right? Okay.
Hey, Bruce,
Yeah.
I can't quite visualize it.
Do we have a torus here? If we don't, you should just look at it afterwards. You can draw one on a torus if we have a Leonard sphere. Just imagine a torus and just draw some curves on it to divide it into toroidal polygons. Polygons on the surface of the torus.
You gotta think about what we did with the sphere. We had the rubber bands around it.
Yeah, you could rubber bands around the torus, yeah.
Rubber bands around the torus.
And then what would that project?
Well, that's the interesting thing. How are you going to project that onto a plane? It's a different story. But you could also make them into plane faces, right? You could have cut planes through it and make it into faces. You could imagine like a prism that was in a ring like that. Like imagine a box that went like this, and that. Okay, so you'd have one face, another face, another face, another face, and you'd have 4 of those. 4 sets of 4 faces. Right?
Yeah.
That would be a toroidal polygon, polyhedra. And you could also draw that same shape on the surface of a torus with curved edges and curved faces. Now,
Isn't this the subject that Gauss, I guess, discussed in his conformal mapping paper, or like a solution that he can map any surface onto any other surface besides just like a sphere?
right,
onto-
but he didn't talk about mapping a torus onto a sphere.
Oh, I thought it was any given surface onto any
That was the but Riemann posed a different problem because conformally you can't map one torus onto another torus. Because the torus is the domain of elliptical domain, which has more parameters in it. Just like you can't map this rectangle onto this rectangle. conformally. And you can prove that to yourself very simply by how can you map it so that the angles of the diagonals will be the same. And if you look at the topology of this, the rectangle is not spherical, it's toroidal. So you can connect this side to this side and that side to that side and then connect them both. Okay, now if you count, do the same thing for the sphere that we did to the torus. What is the characteristic of the possible harmonic divisions of a torus compared to the possible harmonic characteristics of a sphere? You find that the vertices minus the faces plus the edges does not equal 2. It equals a different number, namely 0. And if you take a 2-hole torus, it equals minus 2. You guys can play around to figure out what it will be in other things, right? So now you can think of, we have a visual image of a manifold in effect of self-bounded manifolds. Each manifold has a certain harmonic principles or a range of potential harmonic principles, such as expressed by the regular and semi-regular solids, right? But the range of harmonic principles is bounded by another principle, which can be expressed by this number of the vertices minus the faces plus the edges. But that number is not fixed. That number changes, which then in effect changes the range. That number is in effect an expression of the range of potential harmonic characteristics within that manifold. So that range can be changed by the change of the number of voices that are acting. So in effect, the increasing the number of voices, which is a way to increase the number of singularities, the potential for change, all right, is you can create a visual image of that by this succession of self-bounded manifolds, each of which has a range of harmonic characteristics in which the range of harmonic characteristics can change. And what Riemann is discussing in terms of the P function is that the P function is a concept of, in effect, a manifold of manifolds. Each one has a certain characteristic set of harmonic relationships, but the manifold has a succession in which those harmonic characteristics are changing by the addition of another principle, by the action of the efficient action of another principle. So in this way you can begin to get a sense of a manifold of manifolds which is self-bounded, finite, but has a potential for unlimited development. And this, of course, is the kind of concept which you have to begin to get when you're looking at the concept of physical economy. Because what is the physical economy? How does man's progress in the physical economy occur? It occurs through the discovery by human beings of of new physical principles of science or art. And the culture of mankind, the language cultures of mankind, increase or decrease their power in and over the universe by whether or not that language culture can express and increase, can express and increase or decrease a greater or lesser number of those discoveries of principle of science and art, and whether or not that culture can produce an increase in the number of discoveries of scientific principles. So it's not just the individuals. Obviously, if you have more people, you have a greater potential for the discoveries of new ideas, which is why people who want to limit population are idiots. But the fact is that you need more people. The more people you have, the greater assimilation and potential for creative ideas. But that greater number of people alone does not do it. You have to have a greater number of people which has a culture which is capable of communicating and generating such creative discoveries, and such a visible image, a concept that corresponds to that means by which human progress occurs can be approximated, at least in some degree, by what Riemann's idea of a p-function is. It's a self-bounded manifold which is finite, but has a unlimited potential for development with an anti-entropic characteristic. And its anti-entropic characteristic is expressed by the potential for an increasing density of discoveries of principles of science and art. Right? And that's how progress occurs in the economy. The economy, a physical economy, is not the production of physical goods, although you have to have a certain amount of physical and cultural inputs to be able to produce the creative potential. But the physical and cultural inputs are themselves a function of what the creative potential is. So if you want to increase the physical economy, you have to increase the creative potential of mankind. And that creative potential of mankind is increased by the increase of the ability of that language culture to express and produce new discoveries. Because when new discoveries are discovered, then those principles, which previously were undiscovered, now act in the universe in a completely different way. As I've often pointed out, right? Kepler didn't invent gravity. Gravity existed before Kepler. And man dominated gravity. In wells, in machines, man learned to employ gravity to his benefit. We bent gravity to our will, long before Kepler. But once Kepler discovered the harmonic characteristics of gravitation, then gravity now had a different power in the universe, because it was now on a higher level under man's development. Now, my point is that this idea of Riemann's p-function is not sufficient to really understand, to have a concept of the idea of a manifold that's appropriate to the physical economy, because of two reasons. One is it's a very simple thing. And when you're talking about the physical economy, you have to have a concept of a manifold in which the density of singularities is increasing at an increasing rate. Or the harmonic characteristics are changing so as to support a greater density of singularities at an ever-increasing rate. And secondly, because of what I raised earlier, which is that the development of the physical economy depends the discovery of physical principles of science and art depends on something else, which is a power to make those discoveries, a passion to make those discoveries. There's an emotion, this question of willfulness, because you can't compel somebody to make a discovery. So the culture has to not only be able to create the potential to make the discovery, but it has to have within it the capacity to inspire the generation of those discoveries. So to actually develop an exact concept, to understand this relationship between the physical economy, the noosphere, the biosphere, and the abiotic domain, we have to turn to classical art. And if we then use the insights we gain from classical art to apply to what Riemann is showing us about physical dynamics, then we can begin to form what I consider to be a less imperfect concept, a less inexact concept of a manifold that is of a concept of a manifold which is appropriate to understanding the physical economy. And that's why I think we can gain a lot by looking at taking the provocation that Lin threw out, especially in that June 10th paper, 86, to actually look at what kind of insights can we get from the music, from musical composition, to understanding physical science. And that without that, physical science will come to a halt. Now, again, the point is not to try and understand the music from the standpoint of physical science, but the point is to do what Kepler did, to realize that if you want to understand how the universe is working, you have to rely on the kinds of harmonics which your ear can construct as well as the ones your eye can construct. You have to create both visible and audible images.
I'm having a hard time getting the relationship between the principle and the singularity. Because it seems like earlier talking about the singularity as something as change in an elliptical orbit.
Right.
Which is governed by a principle, right? But then when you look at it in terms of economics and an individual mind making a discovery, you're thinking about the individual mind discovering a principle.
Yeah.
So what?
Well, don't try and look for a formal definition of it. What you're seeing is that in any time you have change, there's intrinsically going to be singularities generated, because the change is going to be changing. Like, very simple, take Riemann's paper on the shock wave. You have an air wave, right? And the air wave is moving in it, and it's governed by certain laws of gas dynamics. And Riemann posed the question before it had been demonstrated experimentally. Well, what happens if we drive these laws of gas dynamics to their boundary? When the speed of the wave, the speed of the thing making the wave, is greater than the speed at which the wave is moving. And he said, well, when you get that, you'll get the formation of a singularity in the form of a shock front. Right? Because what's the shock front? When you've seen those pictures, right? When the shock front is moving, that's just air, right? It looks like an object moving through the air, right? But it's not an object. Before the bullet or the plane reached the speed of sound, the air around it was just moving around in a turbulent way, right? When it gets to the speed of sound, now that turbulence forms a barrier. And that barrier acts like an object, but the object is a singularity, so you've reached into a new domain. So what you get a similar expression in terms of in the development of mankind by the effect of the discovery of a new principle, for example, where without that discovery of that new principle, there's a boundary. There's a boundary on the potential development of mankind. For example, without the discovery of further discoveries of the nature of the subatomic domain, where we can shift human power instead of over primarily chemical processes to nuclear processes, there's a boundary on what the potential for human development is. Right? So the new discovery is a discovery of a new principle which didn't exist beforehand, which now enables us to overcome that boundary. So now mankind has a greater potential for economic development. Right? So it's affected through the discovery of a new principle, which is in effect a singularity. But it also creates a change in the physical economy, creating a potential for that economy to produce more singularities. Because if you have a greater physical and cultural standard of living, you have the potential for a greater number of new discoveries of principles of science and art. Right? So, as I said, don't think about a singularity as a specific definition. It's just the effect of how where you get a boundary condition and the change changes. And I think you'll get another sense of it when we look at it from the standpoint of the music, which we can do this evening. But before we take questions or stop for this, before we take questions and sort of do what we do until we get to this evening, I want to leave you with a thought about the music, just without discussing it, by simply playing for you 2 recordings. We'll leave the third one for this evening. But that is what I want to do is take at least a couple of musical examples to illustrate this point, particularly an example from the second book, the second fugue of the second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, which was composed by Bach. And we want to look at this fugue, and the reason why I picked this fugue is it's particularly beautiful, and it's very pedagogically constructed. It's one of these compositions which is just composed so perfectly that it suits our purpose really well. It expresses the idea really, really beautifully. But we also have the advantage that Mozart was introduced to this set of fugues by von Swieten, and he, as an experiment, in order to learn how these fugues were composed, Mozart transcribed these fugues for a string quartet. And so we have the advantage of hearing these fugues from the standpoint of the same piece of music from two different ways, and you'll see the significance of that when we discuss this later. But I don't want to. We'll discuss it later. But I want to leave you with the thought, so that you can think about this and just experience it, and we'll discuss the significance of it further later. So first is actually, do we have some speakers? Huh?
Yeah. Should I get some?
Because I don't think you'll hear it on this computer.
There's a speaker right there to your left.
Yeah.
Will it plug in?
Yeah. Should. I don't know what Jackson said.
Oh yeah. So now I have to figure out which one of these to plug it into. We'll see. If it doesn't work,
You have to turn it on, I think.
okay. So the first is the fugue as Bach wrote it for the harpsichord.
Hey Bruce, you want to maybe like put on a sample?
Is it coming out there? No. I got the wrong hole. Wait a minute. You plugged it in the wrong place. Okay. Okay, now here's Mozart's transcription of it. Okay, we'll have fun with that later tonight, but I won't leave you with that thought. And we could take any questions if people want to have any discussion before we... Yeah, go ahead.
Was the harpsichord one, was it just two or just one?
Just one harpsichord. Yeah.
That last little flourish was actually three voices.
We'll talk more about the few. Just leave you with what your ears hear.
Because in the harpsichord you just heard one, and then there you heard three.
I think the difference between the two expressions is evident why Mozart did it. But we'll explore the implications. But the point of the thing to think about is just think about, here you have an example, here you have a expression of harmonic characteristics of harmonic characteristics that your ear can hear, which express something different about universal principles than what simply is accessible to the manifold of vision. Yeah.
If you were talking about like weaponry, like bullets or missiles, with the shockwave, was the discovery made like with a bullet? Was it made before Riemann than with aviation? Was it
Nobody knew. No, the existence of shockwaves was not even known until Riemann first hypothesized it. It wasn't experimentally demonstrated until much later. It doesn't mean they didn't exist.
That's what I'm saying, like with their bullets.
No, people didn't know they were shockwaves. They obviously experienced the effects of them.
I mean, did you have to design the bullet differently?
They didn't know.
Oh, they didn't.
Yeah, I got a question about how it is that we come to determine that somehow music and geometry is necessary to unlock the powers of the mind. Whereas in Kuza explicitly says that the human mind comes to understand through comparative relationships, and comparative relationship itself being subject to number, and therefore, since everything is subject to measurement, everything perceivable can be understood. And this can be seen very easy in astronomy, where the astronomer, through the powers of the mind, specifically, well, where the astronomer comes to see that cosmological cycles or celestial cycles cause terrestrial phenomena, like the changing of the seasons. And so he sees with astronomy and arithmetic this, relatively basic, realization that celestial phenomenon causes terrestrial changes. Well, music and geometry is not like, it's self-evident in the natural world as astronomy and arithmetic would have been to the mind of man.
Sure it is.
So, well, yeah, that's the question. And the question then is, what does astronomy come from? Man seeing a fruit roll down a mountain or something, or I mean, where does or music, chirping of a birds? Well, my question is, in the quadrivium, arithmetic and astronomy is clear to my reasoning, but music and geometry is kind of abrasive. I don't know where it is.
Well, we'll work on that. You can do more singing, and that will help you. You'll get it. You'll see. You just do more of it, and you'll see. Rachel, did you have a question?
I was just wondering if the Einstein discovery you were referring to is E equals MC squared.
Well, that was one of them, but no, I was referring to also his work on quantum and all his early works, the papers that he came up with in 1905, and then also special and general relativity. And that was a whole revolution in science. It was based on Planck, but Einstein drew the implications from Planck's discovery that no one else had drawn. And then, so he really created the revolution in physics between Planck and Einstein, which Riemann had anticipated in the habilitation paper, where Riemann talks about how he says you can't assume that the geometry of the physical universe is Euclidean, and he also says you can't necessarily assume that it's the same in the microscopic as in the macroscopic and the astrophysical. And Planck develops the first experimental evidence of that change, and Einstein draws the implications of that. And then what happened is people, since the implications of that contradicted all existing mathematics, the only temporary way to explain some of these phenomena was to use statistical approximations, which Einstein himself used at times. But the insanity that dominated science was that the statistical approximations were the truthful representation of these phenomena, these quantum phenomena. And Einstein resisted that. So Einstein drew the implications which created the conceptual understanding of the existence of quantum effects, but he rejected the way in which they were treated epistemologically by statistical mathematics. That's what I was referring to.
Well, when you say that the macrocosm doesn't have the same characteristics as the microcosm, it sounds like you're saying that it's not universal. So how do you look at universal?
But I'm not saying that it's not universal. I'm saying that it changes, that the characteristics of physical action changes in the microscopic domain and macroscopic. That's what the experimental evidence shows us. For example, you look at the interaction of electromagnetic effects at distances greater than in the macroscopic domain, and you look at small ones below the Coulomb barrier, and then look at the electromagnetic effects in the Crab Nebula. They're not the same.
Does that mean there's a deeper universal that unites the two?
Sure. That we don't know. That's what Einstein was saying. But it's not necessarily a single idea either. It's not necessarily that there's a single universal, but that you get a change. Why do you have to have one geometry for the whole universe?
But like a harmonic
Well, changing. The characteristics are changing, and you have the macroscopic is then you have changing effects in the microscopic and the astrophysical. So you can't take because our field of vision appears to be Euclidean and within the limits of the range of our vision, that somehow that is the way the whole world is, just because that's the way it might appear within the range of our vision. It actually is something much different. Right? So that's what Riemann is getting at. Don't try and come up with an axiomatic geometry which expresses the physical characteristics as a single principle. And Einstein also understood that. That's why he made an offhanded comment about this unified field theory, which got played up into a big PR thing. But he was never as enamored with it as some people said he was. Yeah.
Investigation of the ear. I thought something when you were talking earlier. Was he interested in, because, I mean, plenty of biotic creatures have ears.
Sure.
Right? But there is some sort of link between the human ear and the noetic. Is that what he was investigating?
Well, he was simply looking at how does the human ear work. He hadn't gotten to the point of a comparison of animal ears to human ears, which is another part of the investigation as to what does the human ear do that animal ears don't. Now, there's been a lot of developments in physiology and anatomy which lead into that. I mean, Ned Rosinski did this interesting study of vision, and he was just simply looking at the way in which is in an old Fusion magazine, and he looked at the way in which the retina is mapped onto the visual cortex in different animals, comparing the brain and the visual cortex of fishes and insects and mammals and how those kinds of things. But that's another area of study, which you would want to look at, right? Why is the human ear able to do something that animal ears aren't able to do? Or maybe that's purely cognitive process. I don't know. But is there there is a physiological difference, obviously. What it is, I don't know. Yeah, Brian, you were going to ask.
You were first talking about the universe. You were saying like nature. And you said nature and the universe. And I was just thinking of the Declaration of Independence. It says the laws of nature and nature's God. Mm-hmm. I was wondering do you know, is there why they say nature?
Yeah, well, it's a term they associated with the idea of universal principles. Yeah. That these are not just arbitrary ideas. When they say in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That was not self-evident with respect to the general understanding of man and society at the time. It was not self-evident at all that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights. That was only self-evident with respect to a certain view of man and nature, and that's why they're invoking the nature and nature's God.
You know where that idea comes from?
It's a Leibnizian idea. Yeah. I mean, it's the way Leibniz expressed it, but it comes from Cousin and it comes from Plato. That the principles that govern the affairs of men has to conform with the principles that govern society, that govern nature. But this is what Aristotle was saying, right? That Aristotle's cosmology is an attempt to attribute to nature an ordering process which would justify the oligarchical form of social relations. Right? that there's a world, a heaven up there which is more perfect than down here? So should we break and reconvene, what, around 7? Does that make sense? 7? Okay.